The hospital was buzzing with the usual chaos of a busy day. Nurses rushed from one patient to another, doctors reviewed charts, and families anxiously waited for updates. Among the staff was Maya, a skilled and dedicated Black nurse who had spent years perfecting her craft. She was known for her kindness, professionalism, and ability to remain calm under pressure. But not everyone in the hospital appreciated her talents. Dr. Ethan Reynolds was one of the most respected physicians in the building. He had an impressive resume, a confident demeanor, and the arrogance to match. While his medical skills were undeniable, his attitude towards some of his colleagues was another story. He often dismissed nurses, spoke over them, and made it clear he believed that doctors, especially those like him, were the true backbone of the hospital. To him, nurses were just assistants, helpful but not important. And Maya, despite her expertise, was no exception. It started like any other shift. Maya had been assigned to a high-profile patient, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Langston, who had been admitted the night before. His vitals were stable, but his condition required close monitoring. As Maya checked his IV and adjusted his pillows, she reassured him with her usual warm smile. "How are you feeling this morning, Mr. Langston?" The elderly man smiled back. "Much better, thanks to you. You remind me of my granddaughter, always looking out for me." Just then, the door swung open and Dr. Reynolds walked in. Without so much as a greeting, he glanced at Maya and then at the patient's chart. His eyes scanned the notes she had meticulously written. With a deep sigh, he shook his head. "Maya, these notes are a mess," he said, loud enough for the nearby staff to hear. "If you want to be taken seriously, at least make sure your work is up to standard." Maya blinked, caught off guard by the unnecessary harshness. "Dr. Reynolds, I've recorded everything accurately." Mr. Langston's vitals were stable throughout the night, and his medications were given on schedule. The doctor let out a short, humorless laugh. "Sure, if you say so. But next time, try to be a little more precise. We don't want to waste a doctor's time fixing mistakes, do we?" A few nurses in the hallway exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the way he was speaking to her. Maya, however, remained composed. She had dealt with this kind of attitude before. Rather than argue, she simply nodded. "I'll review the notes again, doctor," she said, keeping her voice even. Mr. Langston, who had been observing the interaction quietly, frowned. "Young man, I don't appreciate you speaking to her like that." Dr. Reynolds barely looked at him. "Mr. Langston, we're just making sure everything is done correctly. You're in good hands." The older man's expression darkened. "I know I am. That's why I trust Maya." Dr. Reynolds smirked. "Trust is good, but expertise is better. Let's just make sure we keep things professional." Maya swallowed her frustration and focused on the patient. "I'll be back shortly to check on you, Mr. Langston." As she left the room, she could feel the stares of her colleagues. Some sympathetic, others awkward, unsure of what to say. This wasn't the first time Dr. Reynolds had spoken down to a nurse, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But what he didn't realize was that he had just insulted someone in front of the most important patient in the entire hospital. A few hours later, as Dr. Reynolds made his way through the hallway, a senior administrator stopped him. "Dr. Reynolds, I need you in the boardroom." "Now." The urgency in her voice caught him off guard. "Is something wrong?" "You'll find out soon enough," she said, leading him down the hall. Inside the boardroom, several hospital executives were seated, along with Mr. Langston, who now looked far less like a frail patient and more like a man of power. Dr. Reynolds hesitated. "Mr. Langston, what's going on?" The elderly man leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp. "Doctor, before we go any further, I need to ask you something." Do you remember how you spoke to Nurse Maya this morning? Dr. Reynolds glanced around the room, suddenly aware that something was very wrong. Aya, well, I was just ensuring everything was done properly. Mr. Langston raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Because from where I was sitting, it sounded like you were belittling one of the best nurses in this hospital. The doctor shifted uncomfortably. I didn't mean any harm. Mr. Langston held up a hand. I don't have much patience for excuses, doctor, especially from someone who doesn't show respect where it's due. Dr. Reynolds frowned. With all due respect, sir, I don't understand why we're discussing this here. The hospital administrator cleared her throat. Dr. Reynolds, you might want to reconsider your tone. Mr. Langston isn't just a patient. He's this hospital's largest donor. Without his contributions, many of our programs wouldn't exist. The realization hit Dr. Reynolds like a freight train. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Mr. Langston leaned forward. Now tell me, doctor, do you still think it's wise to treat my nurse with disrespect? Silence filled the room. Dr. Reynolds had spent years believing he was untouchable, that his position gave him the right to speak however he wanted. But now he was standing in front of a man who had the power to change his entire career with a single decision. Maya had been quiet throughout the meeting, but she could see the shift in the doctor's demeanor. He was no longer the arrogant figure who had spoken down to her that morning. Now he looked like a man who realized he had just made the worst mistake of his career. And the consequences were just beginning. Maya sat quietly in the boardroom, her hands folded in her lap, listening as the tension in the air grew thicker. She had seen Dr. Reynolds act this way before, careless with his words, dismissive toward nurses, and always certain that his title gave him the final say. But for the first time, she saw something new in his expression. Uncertainty. Mr. Langston, still seated at the head of the long conference table, tapped his fingers thoughtfully against the wood. His eyes stayed on Dr. Reynolds, watching the younger man squirm under the weight of the situation. Maya had known the patient was important, but she hadn't realized just how powerful he was until now. Dr. Reynolds cleared his throat, attempting to regain some of his usual composure. Mr. Langston, I meant no disrespect. My priority has always been patient care. If my words were taken the wrong way, I sincerely apologize. Mr. Langston's lips pressed into a firm line. Is that so? Because from what I've seen, you have a habit of treating people like Nurse Maya as if they're beneath you. Tell me, doctor, how many nurses have you spoken to in this way before? How many have simply let it go? Dr. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to being questioned like this, especially not by a patient. His usual confidence was slipping. I respect the nursing staff. I just have high standards. Sometimes things need to be corrected for the sake of efficiency. Maya watched as Mr. Langston let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. Efficiency. That's an interesting word, doctor. What I saw this morning wasn't about efficiency. It was about power. You spoke down to Maya because you thought you could. And that young man is a problem. The hospital administrator, who had remained silent for most of the conversation, finally leaned forward. Mr. Langston isn't just a donor, Dr. Reynolds. He's the reason we have the latest surgical equipment, the reason we've been able to expand our emergency services. When he speaks, we listen. Dr. Reynolds' face paled slightly. He had known Mr. Langston was wealthy, but he hadn't realized just how much influence the man had. I understand, and I regret any offense I may have caused. Mr. Langston studied him for a moment before speaking again. Regret means nothing if you don't change. Do you even realize how valuable someone like Maya is to this hospital? While you were too busy dismissing her, She was making sure my care was handled with the highest level of professionalism. She's been by my side since I was admitted, and not once has she made me feel like just another patient. Can you say the same for yourself? Dr. Reynolds swallowed hard. I don't think that's a fair comparison. Mr. Langston leaned back, crossing his arms. Isn't it? Because from where I stand, a good doctor isn't just someone who knows how to diagnose and treat a condition. A good doctor is someone who values every member of their team and treats them with respect. You may have all the knowledge in the world, but if you can't recognize the importance of people like Nurse Maya, then maybe you're not as great as you think you are. Maya's heart pounded as she listened. She had spent years putting up with dismissive comments, biting her tongue when doctors like Reynolds acted like she was just an extra set of hands instead of a skilled medical professional. But hearing Mr. Langston stand up for her so publicly, it was something she had never expected. The administrator turned her attention to Maya. Nurse Maya, would you be willing to share your thoughts on this situation? Maya hesitated for a moment. She wasn't used to having a platform like this. But as she looked at Mr. Langston, she realized that this was a moment she couldn't let pass. I love my job, she said carefully. I've worked hard to be here, and I know that what I do makes a difference. But there have been times when I've felt invisible, times when I've been dismissed, just because I'm not the one wearing the white coat. She glanced at Dr. Reynolds, whose face remained unreadable. I don't expect everyone to like me, but I do expect to be treated with the same level of professionalism and respect that I give to others. What happened this morning wasn't just about me. It was about the way people in my position are often overlooked. The room was silent for a long moment. Dr. Reynolds looked down at the table, his usual air of authority gone. Mr. Langston let out a slow breath. That's the difference between you and Dr. Reynolds, he said, turning his gaze back to Maya. You lead with compassion, and that's exactly why people like you deserve to be recognized. The administrator nodded in agreement. This hospital prides itself on teamwork. We can't afford to have staff members who don't understand the importance of respect and collaboration. She turned back to Dr. Reynolds, which is why we'll be discussing mandatory training for all physicians on professional conduct and teamwork. Dr. Reynolds' jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew better. Maya felt a mix of emotions, relief, validation, and a sense that, for once, she had truly been heard. Mr. Langston slowly pushed himself up from his chair. Maya, I'll be requesting you as my nurse for the remainder of my stay. And I'll be making sure that nurses like you get the recognition you deserve. Maya felt her chest tighten with gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Langston. That means more than you know. Dr. Reynolds, still standing stiffly in place, looked like he wanted to say something. But before he could, Mr. Langston turned to him one last time. Doctor, I hope you take this as a lesson. Because no amount of intelligence can make up for a lack of respect. And respect, my dear boy, is something you can't fake. With that, he walked out of the boardroom, leaving Dr. Reynolds standing there, his confidence shaken, his arrogance stripped away. And for the first time since Maya had started working at the hospital, she felt like real change was finally coming. Maya walked out of the boardroom feeling a mix of emotions, relief, pride, but also uncertainty. While Mr. Langston had stood up for her, she knew that one conversation wouldn't be enough to change the deep-seated attitudes in the hospital. Dr. Reynolds wasn't the first physician to treat her with disregard, and she doubted he would be the last. As she made her way back to the nurses' station, she could feel the weight of her colleagues' stares. News of what had happened was already spreading, whispers passing from one nurse to another. Some of them gave her nods of encouragement, while others seemed more hesitant, as if they weren't sure if her standing up to a doctor would make things better or worse. Sasha, one of Maya's closest friends in the hospital, pulled her aside. "Girl, I heard what happened," she said in a hushed tone. "Are you okay?" Maya sighed. "I don't know." It felt good to finally say something, but at the same time, "I don't think Dr. Reynolds is going to let this go. You know how he is. If anything, he's probably going to make things harder for me now." Sasha frowned, glancing around before lowering her voice. "I wouldn't be surprised. He's got an ego the size of this hospital. But maybe, just maybe, this time, he bit off more than he can chew." Maya wasn't so sure. Even though Dr. Reynolds had been embarrassed in front of hospital leadership, men like him didn't take humiliation lightly. He had spent years building his reputation, and being called out by a nurse, in front of someone as influential as Mr. Langston, had to have shaken him. As if on cue, Maya spotted Dr. Reynolds down the hall, speaking in hushed tones with a few of his fellow physicians. His posture was stiff, his face unreadable, but when his eyes met hers for the briefest second, she could see it, the resentment. By the time she returned to her rounds, Maya found herself second-guessing every interaction. She had worked hard to get to where she was, and she wasn't about to let Dr. Reynolds intimidate her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Later that day, she was called into the charge nurse's office. Miss Patel, the senior nurse manager, was sitting behind her desk, flipping through a file. Maya took a deep breath before stepping inside. "Maya, take a seat," Miss Patel said, looking up with a neutral expression. "I wanted to check in with you about this morning." Maya hesitated before sitting down. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said cautiously. Miss Patel sighed, setting the file aside. "You didn't. In fact, I think what happened was long overdue. But you need to be careful. I've been in this hospital long enough to know that people like Dr. Reynolds don't just forget things like this. If he feels like his authority has been threatened, he may try to undermine you." Maya felt a lump form in her throat. "I figured as much," she admitted. "I'll be watching," Miss Patel said firmly. "And so will a lot of other people. But I want you to keep doing your job as you always have. Don't let him push you out." Maya nodded, appreciating the support, but the unease in her chest remained. Over the next few days, the tension only grew. Dr. Reynolds wasn't openly hostile, but there were subtle shifts in his behavior. He would leave Maya out of important discussions about patient care, reassign tasks at the last minute, and make it clear in small, calculated ways that he still saw himself as the one in charge. Other nurses noticed too. "He's trying to freeze you out," one of the ER nurses whispered after a long shift. "Like if he ignores you enough, you'll just disappear." Maya refused to let that happen. One evening, as she was reviewing a patient's chart, she overheard Dr. Reynolds speaking with another doctor in the hallway. "She's just a nurse," he was saying in a dismissive tone. "No matter what Langston thinks, people like her don't belong in leadership roles. They get too emotional, too involved. It's a distraction from real medicine." Maya clenched her jaw. The words stung, but more than that, they fueled her determination. She wasn't going anywhere. Maya kept her head high, but she could feel a shift in the air every time she walked into a room. Dr. Reynolds had made it clear he wasn't going to forget what happened. And now his subtle jabs had turned into something worse. Orders were getting misplaced when she was on shift. Crucial updates were being left out of patient charts. And suddenly, she was being written up for minor infractions that no one had cared about before. She tried to shake it off, but deep down, it was getting harder. The constant pressure, the passive-aggressive remarks from certain doctors, and the extra scrutiny from administration were beginning to take their toll. Even some of the nurses who once stood by her now avoided speaking out. It was easier to stay quiet than to be dragged into the storm. Then one evening, something happened that pushed everything to the edge. It was a busy night in the ER, and Maya was tending to a patient in critical condition, a man who had collapsed from a suspected heart attack. The team was working in sync, but at the last second, just as she reached for the proper medication, Dr. Reynolds stopped her. "You're not authorized to make that call," he said coldly, pulling the vial from her hands. Maya's heart pounded. "Doctor, the patient needs this now. His vitals are dropping." "I'll be the one to decide that," he cut in, turning to a junior nurse. "Give me the other medication instead." Maya's stomach dropped. She knew that wasn't the right treatment. If they delayed, if they gave the wrong dose, it could cost the patient his life. "Dr. Reynolds, that's not." "Are you questioning my expertise?" His voice was sharp, and suddenly all eyes were on them. Maya hesitated, torn between speaking up and risking yet another complaint against her or staying silent and letting a mistake happen. A beeping sound from the monitor jolted everyone back to reality. The patient's condition was deteriorating fast. Maya swallowed hard. "Doctor, please, just look at the chart one more time." Dr. Reynolds shot her a glare, but before he could respond, another voice broke through the tension. "What's going on here?" Heads turned, and Maya's breath caught when she saw Mr. Langston standing in the doorway. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced with an expression of concern as he took in the scene before him. Dr. Reynolds straightened, clearing his throat. "Nothing to worry about. We're handling the situation." Mr. Langston's eyes moved between them, then landed on Maya. "Are we?" For the first time that night, Maya felt a sliver of hope. She wasn't alone in this. But Dr. Reynolds wasn't done yet. "Mr. Langston, with all due respect, this is a medical matter," he said smoothly. "And I don't believe a nurse should be making these kinds of calls." Maya clenched her fists. The patient on the table was still struggling, every second passing like an eternity. She didn't have time for this battle. And then, just when she thought it couldn't get any worse, a sharp, piercing alarm rang through the room. The patient's heart rate had flatlined. Panic filled the room as the sharp, continuous alarm rang out. The patient's heart had flatlined, and for a split second, time seemed to freeze. Maya's pulse raced as she immediately reached for the defibrillator, but Dr. Reynolds hesitated. His hand hovered over the raw medication, his pride blinding him to the critical seconds slipping away. "Doctor, we need to act now." Maya's voice cut through the tension, urgency pushing aside her fear. But instead of responding, Dr. Reynolds shot her a cold glare. "You are not in charge here," he snapped. Maya barely heard him. Her instincts took over. Ignoring the weight of his authority, she grabbed the correct medication, swiftly administering it while another nurse prepared the paddles. "Clear," she called out as she pressed the defibrillator against the patient's chest. A jolt surged through his body, but the monitor still showed no rhythm. Dr. Reynolds stepped forward, fury in his eyes. "You're overstepping, nurse." But before he could finish, a weak beep echoed from the monitor. Then another. The patient's heart rate slowly climbed back, stabilizing right before their eyes. A wave of relief swept through the room, but it was quickly replaced by something heavier. A thick, suffocating silence as everyone registered what had just happened. Maya had saved the patient, but in doing so, she had defied a senior doctor in front of the entire medical team. Dr. Reynolds' expression darkened. His jaw clenched as he turned to her, voice low and threatening. "You just made a serious mistake." Maya held his stare, refusing to back down. The only mistake would have been letting him die. The tension in the air was unbearable, But before Dr. Reynolds could say anything else, a new voice interrupted. "I'd like to have a word with both of you." Now, everyone turned as Mr. Langston stepped forward, his face unreadable. But his tone left no room for argument. Without another word, he gestured for them to follow him out of the ER. Maya swallowed hard, nerves twisting in her stomach. She knew she had done the right thing, but she also knew how this looked. Defying a doctor, no matter the reason, could cost her everything. As she followed Mr. Langston down the hall, she caught sight of the other nurses and staff exchanging glances, their expressions a mix of admiration and apprehension. Dr. Reynolds walked beside her, his silence more unsettling than his words. When they reached Mr. Langston's office, he shut the door behind them and turned, his piercing gaze locking onto Dr. Reynolds. "You were about to let that man die," he said, his voice controlled but sharp. Dr. Reynolds stiffened. "That's a serious accusation." "I don't make accusations. I state facts," Mr. Langston cut in. He then turned to Maya, his expression softening just slightly. "And you saved his life." Maya exhaled, but before she could speak, Mr. Langston's next words sent a shockwave through the room. "That man is more than just a patient," he said. "He's the hospital's largest donor, and my father." Dr. Reynolds' face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The weight of Mr. Langston's revelation settled over the room like a thunderclap. The man whose life he had nearly let slip away was the very person funding the hospital's cutting-edge research, renovations, and even his own salary. Maya's heart pounded, but she remained still, watching the doctor process what had just been said. Mr. Langston didn't give him time to recover. "My father's life was in your hands, and you let arrogance take priority over proper care," he continued, his voice eerily calm. "If Maya hadn't stepped in, you would have killed him." Dr. Reynolds finally found his voice. I wasn't going to." "Enough." Mr. Langston raised a hand, silencing him. "Your actions today will have consequences." Maya expected Dr. Reynolds to argue, to shift the blame, but instead, his shoulders slumped. The confidence that had once dripped from every word he spoke was gone. Mr. Langston turned to Maya, his expression softening. "You saved my father's life. I'll be speaking with the hospital board about your future here." Maya's stomach clenched. "Sir, He shook his head, a small smile breaking through the tension. "I mean that in the best way possible. You deserve recognition, not reprimand." Dr. Reynolds, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to disappear. He finally turned to Maya, his voice barely above a whisper. "I misjudged you." Maya studied him for a moment, then nodded. She wasn't sure if his words were genuine or just a desperate attempt to salvage what little was left of his reputation. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had stood her ground, and a life had been saved because of it. Before anyone could say another word, the door swung open, and a nurse peeked in. "Mr. Langston, your father is awake. He's asking for Maya." Maya's breath hitched. Without hesitation, she followed the nurse out, leaving Dr. Reynolds and Mr. Langston behind. As she stepped into the patient's room, she found herself face to face with the man whose life had changed everything. His eyes, though tired, were full of warmth. "You," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "You're the reason I'm still here." Maya smiled. "I just did my job." He chuckled weakly. "No, you did much more than that." As she sat beside him, the weight of the day finally settled in. She had walked into her shift as just another nurse fighting for respect. Now she was leaving with a newfound strength, knowing that doing the right thing would always matter more than fear. And somewhere down the hall, Dr. Reynolds sat alone, realizing that for the first time in his career, he had been the one taught a lesson. Maya sat beside Mr. Langston's bed, watching his chest rise and fall steadily. The machines beeped in rhythm, a soothing reminder that he was stable, alive. He looked at her with kind eyes, filled with gratitude, and she couldn't help but smile. She had fought hard to make sure he received the care he deserved, and now, looking at him, she knew it had all been worth it. "You remind me of my daughter," he said after a moment, his voice low but full of warmth. Strong, determined, never afraid to stand up for what's right. Maya felt a lump in her throat. She had spent so much of her career fighting for respect, often being overlooked or dismissed. But here was a man who truly saw her. "I just wanted to make sure you got the care you needed," she said softly. Mr. Langston chuckled, "And because of you, I did." "That doctor, what's his name again?" "Dr. Reynolds," Maya replied, glancing toward the door as if expecting him to walk in. "Ah, yes," Mr. Langston said, shaking his head. "I imagine this has been a humbling day for him." Maya didn't respond, but she knew he was right. Dr. Reynolds had built his career on power and authority, but today he had learned that respect had to be earned. A few hours later, Mr. Langston's son returned, stepping into the room with a serious expression. "The board has been informed," he said, looking at Maya. "There are going to be some changes." Maya's stomach tightened. What kind of changes? "First of all," he said, crossing his arms, "Dr. Reynolds has been placed on probation. His behavior today was unacceptable, and there will be a full review of his conduct." Maya exhaled slowly. It wasn't immediate justice, but it was a start. "And you," Mr. Langston's son continued, his tone shifting, "are getting a promotion." Maya's eyes widened. "What?" "The hospital needs people like you. People who care about their patients more than their egos," he said. "Effective immediately, you'll be leading the new training initiative for incoming medical staff. We need to ensure that what happened today never happens again." Maya blinked in disbelief. She had spent years being overlooked, doubted, but now she was being given a real opportunity to make a difference. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Langston's son smiled. "Completely. You've earned this." Tears stung at the corners of Maya's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. She had fought so hard for moments like this, and now it was finally happening. As she walked out of the room later that night, she found herself standing in front of Dr. Reynolds' office. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see him sitting at his desk, staring at a blank piece of paper. He looked exhausted, lost. For a moment, she considered walking away. He had treated her unfairly, dismissed her, humiliated her. He didn't deserve her sympathy. But then she thought about the lessons she had learned today, about integrity, about strength, about rising above hate. She knocked lightly on the door. Dr. Reynolds looked up, his face etched with regret. "I just wanted to say," she said, stepping inside, "that I hope you learn from this." He exhaled, running a hand over his face. "I already have." Maya nodded, then turned to leave. She didn't need an apology. She didn't need validation. She had already won. As she walked out of the hospital, the cool night air wrapped around her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't felt before: peace. This wasn't just about one patient, one doctor, or even one hospital. This was about change, and Maya knew that change had to start somewhere. For her, it started today. Max stood his ground, his powerful stance unwavering as he growled deep in his throat. His eyes darted between the three bikers, analyzing every movement. The leader, still shaken from nearly being bitten, clenched his jaw and shot a glare at the other two men. They hesitated, clearly debating whether or not to engage. But something about the dog had them second-guessing. Lily, still holding her tiny flower, clutched it tightly in her small hand. Her heart beat a little faster, sensing that something wasn't right, but she trusted Max completely. He had always been there for her, from the moment she could walk. Her dad, a former police officer, had trained Max himself. He wasn't just a family pet, he was a protector. One of the bikers, the one in the gray jacket, exhaled sharply and shook his head. "Man, this is a bad idea," he muttered under his breath. "It's just a kid. Let's go." His hands tightened around the handlebars of his bike, and he looked ready to ride off. But the leader wasn't convinced. His eyes flicked around the park. Parents sat on benches, some pushing strollers or tossing frisbees to their dogs. But no one was paying attention. No one had seen what had almost happened. To everyone else, they were just three guys hanging out near a little girl and her dog. The opportunity was still there. His hand twitched at his side, debating his next move. "That's just a dog," he spat, trying to regain control. "We can handle a dog." Max let out another warning growl, his ears pinned back, his muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. He wasn't just standing his ground, he was waiting, watching, calculating. Lily's father had trained him to read situations, to react only when necessary, but to never hesitate when the time came. Right now, Max was locked in, focused. The second they made a wrong move, he would be ready. The man in the gray jacket sighed and turned to the third biker, the quiet one with the dark beard. "What do you think?" he asked. The bearded man remained silent, but his eyes darted between Max and the leader, as if weighing the risks. His fingers drummed against the gas tank of his bike. "Something's off about this," he finally muttered. "That's no ordinary dog." The leader scoffed but didn't argue. He glanced down at Max again, watching the way his chest rose and fell in slow, controlled breaths. Something about him did feel different. He wasn't barking frantically like most dogs would in this situation. He wasn't lunging randomly or showing reckless aggression. He was still, measured. The leader narrowed his eyes. "That's a police dog, isn't it?" Lily tilted her head, confused by the question. "Max is my best friend," she said simply, her voice soft but sure. The gray-jacketed biker sucked in a sharp breath, his expression shifting from uncertainty to alarm. "No way," he muttered. "If that dog's trained, we're in trouble." The leader clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists. He didn't like backing down, but something in his gut told him this wasn't worth it. A police-trained K9 was a different kind of threat. A dog like that wouldn't just bark and chase. They knew how to disable attackers. And if this dog was really trained, then someone had to have trained him. Which meant someone close to this kid knew exactly what they were doing. "Forget it." The leader finally growled under his breath. "Let's go." He yanked his helmet back over his head, his frustration clear as he climbed onto his bike. The gray-jacketed biker didn't waste a second, starting his engine immediately. The bearded man lingered just a moment longer, his eyes flickering toward Lily. She still held onto her flower, her expression innocent and unafraid. But that dog was something else. Max never broke his gaze. Even as the bikers revved their engines and pulled away, he remained on high alert, watching them disappear down the path. Only when they were completely out of sight did he finally relax, his muscles loosening ever so slightly. Lily, still unaware of the true danger she had just escaped, reached down and gently patted Max's head. "Good boy, Max," she whispered, as if she knew he had just done something important. Max let out a small, content huff, but his eyes remained watchful. Because while the bikers were gone for now, something told him this wasn't over yet. As the roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, Max remained on edge, his ears still perked, his sharp eyes scanning the park. He knew danger when he sensed it, and something about those men didn't sit right with him. Lily, unaware of just how close she had been to real danger, crouched down and hugged Max tightly, her small arms wrapping around his thick fur. She giggled softly, as if this was just another playful afternoon in the park, but Max's stance never fully relaxed. He had been trained for moments like this. He understood threats in a way Lily never could.